maybe have somebody else help us with that approach. It's a fairly complex process with our current data to explore the integrated population model, similar to what they're doing with sage grouse west-wide. That could take up to a year if I had to put a number on it.
I had one more question too, in regard to something where we're creating the benchmarks for certain game animals, and then we have created the benchmark for elk species to be 15 males to 40 females. Is that correct? And then there was mentioned that we don't even quite get to that ratio optimally statewide, and I was wondering what the department's going to do about that, or what plans do you have in place to try to meet those objectives?
Brian Wakeling for the record. Mr. Chairman, Commissioner Hubbs, in most of our there's several things that drive our recommendations for quotas for various species. One of the other, probably the overriding factor that influences our recommendations on elk are the elk subplans. And so in most of the elk subplans, there's a population limit that we strive not to exceed. And so in an effort to do that, what we're forced to do is harvest substantially more female elk than we do male elk. And in so doing, what we wind up doing is winding up with a highly skewed bull to cow ratio. And so it's, in many cases, it's almost 1-to-1. 70 to 100 is not uncommon. And so what we see is a older age class component of the adult male, which is a conservative management plan and largely desired. That's our objective at this point in time, is not to reduce it to what the plan says. What we want to point out is that we have a difference from what the plan says, and what our perceived target is, just looking at the data on our current harvest, is that we want to maintain that older age class component in the harvest of the males. And so we want to manage for that 25 to 35%. Should we exceed that, see a larger proportion of that in the harvest, what that would indicate to us is that they're more available and we have the opportunity to provide more tags. On the other hand, if it drops below that, we've been harvesting it more aggressively and we may want to reduce tags. And so that's how we would take that target and use that moving forward.
Commissioner Young.
Brian, first, thanks for putting together this, coordinating this presentation, and certainly helped me understand some of the quota questions I have. Just a couple questions I have for the group. You know, the last 30 years, Nevada's had a drastic change in what we hunt and how we hunt, and the priorities of hunting. I know growing up here, hunting, sheep was not as prevalent as it is today. Certainly the dollars weren't put into it, and these organizations that have stepped forward and really improved hunting overall, but specifically derived from a lot of that, have made some changes. Certainly the introduction of elk into the state, you didn't see any elk. Even in Area 7, I hunted extensively in my younger years, and you occasionally see one wander down from Idaho maybe, but look at what we have today. How is the elk, I don't know if the average hunter understands, and that includes me, how the elk population increases affected the deer hunting and the quota setting. And I think that's the hardest question to explain to folks out there, the average hunter that I run into. I'm not sure folks understand what that is. I don't know that a lot of people have had an opportunity to hunt elk in Nevada. I got my first tag that I drew with 9 points this year. And so you don't get a lot of chances to hunt elk, and how much more difficult they are to hunt than deer. And I don't know that folks understand that, but is there a way to maybe offer more explanation on a general basis to the hunters so that they could understand what you just did in a more simplistic terms. Certainly the formulas and the different things you're moving towards and trying are good to use a variety of different ways of getting true population samples. But I don't know if that's a very long-winded question. It is, if you can even answer it. But hopefully you're getting some of what I'm asking you to do.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Commissioner Young, Brian Wakeling for the record. There are a lot of differences between elk and deer. And primarily when people start to think about the influence that elk have on mule deer, typically they associate the presence of elk with decreased numbers of mule deer. Routinely, when you look at the diets of the animals, mule deer tend to be more of a browser in general, and elk tend to be more of a grazer in general. And so their forage items do not routinely overlap. However, when you get into periods of the year in which forage resources are limited, typically if you're looking at a winter time period, elk are definitely capable of, they have the competitive advantage over deer. Now, there's a lot of information that's been written over the years. I've written some of it on the effects of elk and deer competition. And it's, in most cases, the competitive conditions are probably overrated. Under really tough situations, they certainly can have an influence. They can also have an influence on predator communities. You'll see changes in the predator communities because you do have a different prey base. And so things like mountain lions versus coyotes may come in at a slightly different level. And so you may see changes there. You certainly see differences in concerns from landowners that may be living in an area where those animals also come in. They certainly have different impacts on those landowners.
And also, wouldn't they be fighting over the same water sources, and when there's scarcity of water, it would seem like the elk might have an advantage, or is that an inaccurate statement?
They have a competitive advantage. They don't often have to exercise it.
How about wild horses and how it impacts those quotas, both in deer and in elk? And what we're seeing in this state with the lack of the BLM doing what, they're required to do, and this population just getting so large.
Horses and burros have a very strong competitive advantage. When you look at, without getting too technical, elk and deer are ruminant animals. Ruminant animals like cattle. They have a 4-compartment stomach, and the first compartment is a fermentation vat. That fermentation vat has to break particle sizes down to about 5 millimeters in diameter before it can move out of the rumen into the reticulum. Horses don't have that. Burros don't have that. They have a cecum at the end, but it doesn't require particle size to reach a certain size. What that allows them to do is, in a situation where forage quality is really low, horses can eat a lot of volume and make up for poor quality by eating volume. Ruminant animals, when they're faced with low quality forage, they actually slow down their consumption rate. So horses and burros are in a low quality forage situation, they can easily outcompete ruminant animals. The other thing that differs between those species is that horses and burros tend to be they have very dominant personalities, and this can be a real issue around water sources, and they can actually exclude some of the ungulates from those situations.
Thank you, Mr. Wakeling. Answer your question, Commissioner Young. Further questions from the commission? Seeing none, this is a cab workshop. I'd like to engage the cabs in this conversation if they have any questions for the department on their presentation.
Record, Paul Dixon. Question that I have is that when you're doing your surveys, most of it's visuals. You guys have any sort of videoing, secondary analysis, flying over and you want to look at vegetation, bed and other things, and do vegetation, you can get snow covered stuff. It's collected independent of the looker. So the looker just has to look at one thing, and to use things like animals, help count animals as you get high story or cover in areas where you in or something. So I'm wondering how you use other techniques that we use in a lot of other places. In fact, there's a lot of algorithms for deconvoluting very complex signals in video. I just wonder if you're doing any of that stuff.
Mr. Chairman, members of the commission, the department is exploring other technologies. This last summer, for instance, we've been toying with forward-looking infrared to just get information on fawn ratios. Forward-looking infrared is it's able to detect temperature differences, and it's not the cheapest thing out there, and a lot of the video tends to have relatively narrow field of view. There's a lot of forward-looking infrared is something that has been around for decades. I think the first paper that I read that dealt with this was in 1978. Technology has improved since then. We're still not at a point where we can say that it definitively works. If we can get to the point where we can use unmanned aircraft to pick up the kind of data that we need and store it permanently, that's a place that we'd love to get to. When you look at, one of the reasons that we invest so much in our air operations is when you look across the board at where human mortality occurs in the wildlife field, it deals with aerial operations. That's the most frequent place where people lose their lives. And so to the extent that we can keep everybody safe and do so effectively, we certainly want to. And we continue to explore that. We don't have any perfect or even something that's going to replace it at this point in time.
Thank you, Mr. Wakeling.
Mr. Chairman and the commission, my name is Mike Turnipseed. I'm from the Douglas Cab. I understand the counts and the success ratios of archery and muzzleloader and any illegal weapon. I suspect that, along the Sierra front here, 192, 194, we have 3 more reasons for loss than just archery, muzzleloader, and illegal weapon. At certain times of the year, there's a deer a day killed between Genoa, I live in Genoa, between Genoa and Carson City. I suspect the same in Reno. So in addition to muzzleloader, archery, illegal weapon, we've got lots of cats, lots of bears, and lots of cars. Is that just a given loss that goes into your model? Same every year?
Record, Cody Schroeder, Department of Wildlife. So that's a very good point. Excellent point, actually. We do attempt to account for that. So we've been collaring mule deer and calculating survival rates, for instance, outside of the hunting season. The survival rate is used in the population model, so we don't assume 100% doe survival outside of the hunting season. We typically use about 80 to 83% for mule deer does. And bucks, we have a similar survival rate for bucks. In certain areas where we have had known sources of mortality like that, particularly in Area 7 along Pequot Summit, we actually have been factoring out, just like we would with harvest, like 300 animals per year because we know they get hit by cars on the highway. So we actually are in addition to the harvest, extracting those from the population. Now, the Carson front has been a challenge. We don't have great data on that because it tends to be spread out into different areas. We are working with Department of Transportation on getting a centralized database to try to account for that. But right now, we're just approaching it from a survival standpoint, and we might lower the survival rate if we think there's increased mortality. It is a given every year.
Further questions from the cabs for the department?
Greg Burnside, Douglas Cab. I'm just curious if there's been any areas besides Area 17 that you've deployed this and you just had Joe come and report on it, and whether there is or not, what's your expansion plan for using the more random sampling?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Brian Wakeling again. Excellent question. Yes, we have been exploring with this in another area. That's been in Area 10. As with anything that we're experimenting with, we're not looking to, in the next 3 weeks, go ahead and expand this statewide. We've still got some kinks to work out of it. I think, not to call out Caleb and put him on the spot, but Caleb McAdoo is the other biologist who's been working with this and implementing it, and I think he would probably reflect that his experience has probably been pretty similar to Mr. Bennett's. I don't want to put words in his mouth, but we've got some more tinkering to do with the process and with the survey before we start expanding this too much broadly. Right now, we're picking places where we know we've got fairly common deer populations. One of the challenges that we're going to have is trying to expand this into a place where we have very low numbers of deer already throughout the management area. And so until we kind of get this kind of worked out, I don't think that we're looking to expand too broadly, but we do want to continue to expand it as we work the kinks out. Alternatively, we may find out that there may be another, we're going to continue to search, but there may be another technique that ultimately functions better. Go ahead and turn some time over to Cody as well.
Cody McKee, for the record, I was going to provide Caleb an opportunity if he has any added insight into his experience, if he wanted to come up and talk about it for a few minutes, or if he's happy that we covered it in sufficient detail. Knowing Caleb, I'm sure we missed something.
For the record, Caleb McAdoo, and I'd like to apologize for my attire. I'm actually on my day off and just wanted to come and listen to the discussions on this, so if you'll excuse me for that, I'd appreciate it. I thought the conversations were really good, covered a lot of the challenges of any time you implement a new method. There's inherent challenges, there's always costs, and hopefully there's always added benefits. I think we see those added benefits outweighing the costs, but as Joe mentioned, the big picture for an area biologist, you're putting together what you see on the ground with what you see in the air, and it gives us a distinct advantage anytime we go into land use planning conversations with the BLM or the Forest Service. That's where, from a regional field level, we really get our knowledge and our seat at the table. And so I think that's our biggest concern from the field level, is losing that by flying less of the area. Maybe some of that knowledge gap, we're going to have to find out a way to fill that hole. But again, Joe covered it well. The other challenge that I see, and both the Codys touched on it in some form or fashion, and I think even Joe was, within that optimal period, November 10th to the 24th. Quite frankly, there are very few units, at least within the region I'm associated with, where we don't have ongoing bull elk hunts during that time frame. And so at some point, there's going to have to be a decision made, in my mind anyway. You know, what do we fly over hunters, primarily bull elk hunters, during a critical time to them to get more accurate, unbiased data for some of our other species? And I think that's a challenge that this commission and our department's going to have to work towards moving forward. Again, I think it's always good to explore the process, and as Cody said, I usually like to talk, so I'll stop now.
Thank you, Caleb. Further cab questions for the department? Agenda item 19A. Okay. Seeing none, any further questions from the commission? Commissioner Barnes.
I guess, not really a question, just a comment. And, you know, when you were talking about the sampling, the way you're going to do it, you know, as I was watching, there were some concerns came up and I started making notes. And then at the end of the presentation, you had them all listed, the same ones I had. So I guess the comment I have to make, though, and Caleb kind of alluded to it, you know, with what you're losing, does that outweigh the benefit? Because like Caleb said, because you're putting what's on the ground to the air. And, you know, there's so much more you can see than just deer counts. You're looking at body condition of your animals, which is an indication of habitat. And you may see changes over time where these animals are using one area over another one. So I guess the comment I have is just, are we going to lose that? I mean, I guess you could balance that out, you know, rotate around and do different things different years, but that's one of the concerns that I have, is I don't want to lose that valuable information.
If I may, Mr. Chairman, Commissioner Barnes, that's absolutely something we don't want to lose either. And, you know, Mr. Bennett pointed out that with the implementation of this part, we're actually flying over areas that we wouldn't normally fly. And so we gain some by seeing some of that, while we may be sacrificing in one year where we may fly. We randomize it each year, and so you may not have flown this portion of it this year, but you'll fly that next year. And then to kind of come back to the comment Mr. Dixon made, we're constantly exploring new ways to try to get better information on the collecting better data on stuff we need now. Right now, it gives a biologist some insight, but it doesn't really quantify it particularly well. Similarly, you know, I think you may have heard Rick Thielman, chief pilot, speak about how much those aircraft were flying. The one was about 680 hours a year, the other about 610. Your average pilot, and one of the comments that kind of came in on our review was the amount of time and the work allocation for our pilots. An average pilot is routinely going to be flying 400 to 500 hours tops, and we're putting our pilots through an awful lot more. And so there's a lot of trade-offs, but if we were able to get our surveys done with less effort, what that would allow us to do is free up those helicopters, and perhaps one of the concerns I have is that, you know, November may not be the best time to be up looking at habitat. Maybe May is when we want to do that. And so if we can free up some time, there doesn't mean that we can't use those helicopters to provide that kind of a service, but we want to optimize that as well. And so all of those things are part of the conversation that we're having as we're going through this. Like I say, this isn't something that we're still in the experimental phases of. We're not prepared to go statewide with it, but we've got an internal working group that deals with bighorn sheep, and one of the things they're starting to discuss is methods by which we can optimize our survey effort there as well. So we want to keep doing the best job we can, And so we're going to continue to explore and try and find the best and the most appropriate. Rarely is anything perfect, but we're going to strive very hard not to give up anything.
Commissioner Young. Thank you, Mr. Wakeling.
And Brian, just food for thought. I mean, I'm an old helicopter pilot and turbine rated, and when I was the commander of Metro PD's helicopter unit, I thought they were the greatest tool ever invented for law enforcement. But I got to admit, I went to a drone convention recently, and I came back really impressed with the strides that they've made in that technology, and they're moving really rapidly in it, very rapidly. And couple that with satellite imagery that's in place that is now getting more and more accessible to the public and non-military use. Just start looking at it because, you know, elk season for me this year, he hit the point right in the head, November 6th through the 20th. That's prime time. These drones don't make the noise. They're much cheaper to operate. The cameras they're putting in them now. And if you use the right operator and a plan's developed, they're as effective as helicopters, probably more effective, to be honest with you, cost-wise. So start getting on it. You'll be surprised.
Thank you, Commissioner Young. Further comments or questions from the commission? I want to thank the department for putting this presentation together, and I hope the cabs are taking something home with it and share it with your fellow members. And I think with that, we'll close agenda item 19A. And before we move to agenda item 19B, I think we need to take a lunch break. I, for one, feel like I need something to make the rest of the day go. And we'll take a lunch break until 1:30. Call the meeting back to order with agenda item 19B, evaluation and review of the Landowner Deer and Antelope Compensation Tag Program. Game Division Administrator Brian Wakeling for possible action. The department will provide an overview concerning the current Landowner Deer and Antelope Compensation Program, recent updates to statutes, share current practices, identify areas of necessary improvement, and provide a potential revision process for the Commission's consideration. The Commission may provide the department with direction following consideration of this proposal. Mr. Wakeling.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the Commission. Good afternoon. Brian Wakeling, Game Chief with Nevada Department of Wildlife. Everybody probably vividly remembers some of the challenges we had this year as we were working with the issuance of our Landowner Deer and Antelope Compensation Tags this year. There were a number of counts that were conducted throughout the year. As we went through that, we learned a little late in the game that we'd had more individual landowners who had engaged in agreements with us. We learned that our counts were increasing, and we had a real challenge as we went into the May quota setting period with the number of tags that landowner cooperators had qualified for and the number that the Commission was available to or was able to authorize. And so wanted to kind of review that again just real briefly. Initially, it was in February that the department really recognized that we were seeing this increased participation. At the February 10th Commission meeting, there was some information conveyed to the Commission that this was occurring. In April, we actually sent out the first information to the landowners to inform them that we may actually hit the cap this year. We solicited some feedback at that point in time. During that time, with the legislative session ongoing, Senate Bill 511 was being considered, and there was an opportunity at that point to institute a legislative fix, if you will, that basically bumped that cap from 1.5% to 2.5%. And so that was communicated to the landowner cooperators at that point in time. And then on June 12th, we notified the landowners that Senate Bill 511 had become law. It was signed in on June 9th. And at that point, we also distributed the tags, or the vouchers for the tags at that point in time. Subsequent to that, we also distributed copies of those letters back to the commission so they would have those and be aware of that. So reviewing the, kind of how we got there, what do we have now? This process is regulated both through NRS and NAC. Field personnel have to implement this program, and they do so in a fairly consistent manner. But we wanted to conduct an administrative review of the program and provide the commission with that oversight. This was something that was discussed at the June commission meeting. The commission chose to review this as a commission and not delegate it to a particular committee. And so we wanted this to be the first step, just kind of sharing with the commission what the department's review showed. In the support material for this item, we tried to include all of the relevant statutes and administrative code, so that would have that. 502.145 is the one that enables the program, and there's a few relevant excerpts from that. Essentially, this one, Section 3, talks about the department reviewing the application, some of the other administrative stuff, but what it really boils down to is that it shall issue the applicant not more than one tag for each 50 animals present on the private land. So, not more than one for 50. So it could be one for 100, but the way this has been interpreted throughout the history of the program is that when we do the count, it takes 50 animals to qualify for one tag. And it's on a mutually agreed upon evening when these animals are counted. And throughout this, as I communicated with landowner cooperators, one thing that was made pretty clear to me is that no matter where we are in the state, I heard concerns that, landowners would use the phrase, well, there were 48 on my property, and just over the fence there were 15 more, and that guy wouldn't give me a tag for it. And so I don't think there's any inconsistency. I think we've been implementing it consistently across the state. The other thing I'd also like to add is that virtually every, I would say not virtually, every communication that I've had with a landowner cooperator from this program, sometimes they've been animated, but they've always been polite, and they've always been pretty understanding of the process and what we were working through. Section 6, and this is the other aspect of the tag issuance, as long as it's consistent with the sections adopted, the commission applied to the issuance, the use of the tags, the commission, and this is where the cap comes in, shall by regulation establish the maximum number of tags which may be issued annually by the department, and that's done this year was, if I remember correctly, it was CR 1714, where it established the cap, and which must not exceed 1.5%. This was amended to be 2.5% after the commission met, but the commission anticipated the potential for that and had language in the CR that allowed for it, and so that 2.5% of the total tags This was the first year in recent history that the commission chose to use last year's quota in the total number of deer and antelope tags established through the CR process from last year to establish the 2.5%, that quota for the landowner deer and antelope tags. Previously, it used to be the current year. Probably a much more comparable way to look at things because the deer and antelope compensation tags are based off of counts from last year. So the commission made that conscious decision to use that in May of this year. The other thing that this part of the NRS states is that the commission may adopt any other regulations it deems necessary to carry out the provisions of this section. The one thing we encountered as we were going through this year was that we don't have any regulations in place that specifically states to, if we're going to meet the cap, how would the commission choose to equitably allocate those tags? And the commission considered some, but because the Senate Bill 511 was actually signed into a bill, it became unnecessary to address it this year. Currently, for looking at the number of tags that were authorized, went from 301 as the cap to 502 for the cap next year if no other tags are issued. So typically, this year we reached a record number and we issued 360. So there's quite a substantial room for growth still in there, but it's not out of the realm of possibility that at some point we might be up against that cap again. So some of the other administrative code that this covers, 502-426, talks about the requirements of eligibility. 4248 is the cooperative agreement. 4252, notice of damage and inspection of the property, assessment. Within 10 days after the department receives notice of damage, the department shall inspect the property claimed to have been damaged. And so after reviewing this, the primary challenges that we dealt with through the process was that we did not see the problem coming soon enough. And we didn't have a method to address reduction in tags issued. One of the other requirements is that it speaks to mitigating factors, things that could mitigate the damage. And currently, and that's kind of a secondary challenge, but it's still a real part of this, we don't have a real good documentation of mitigating actions. What actions did landowners mutually agree upon with the department? And so, again, just to kind of go through some of the historical information, looking at the history of the program, what we're looking at in this slide are the number of tags that are authorized and the number of tags that are issued. Routinely, there's 8 to 10 tags that aren't requested for issuance each year, and so that tends to be a little bit of conservatism that's built in. Looking at the tags by species, the blue on this slide is not real visible, but those are antelope tags. By far the preponderance are deer tags. When you look at those together, this is the number of landowner cooperators that are participating. The blue again is antelope, the red is deer, the yellow is the combined. If you notice, it doesn't look additive, and that's because some landowners are eligible for both deer and antelope, and so it's not a one-for-one increase. Looking at the average number of tags that a landowner qualifies for, there has been a slight increase, probably from about 2.5 to almost 3 for deer tags, but on antelope it's bounced around, and we have annual fluctuations, and this last year was not the highest qualifying at all for that. Looking at the historical cap and allocation, you can see how this was approaching. We've had a number of years, the red line being what the historical cap was, the blue line being the allotment. 2017 was the first year that we were going to exceed it. Because we were able to have the legislative amendment to that the cap, the cap actually went up and we did not exceed it. One of the other things that people look at is, well, is this because, what effect does the deer population or the antelope population size play into that? We've actually seen the deer population still hovering around 100,000, but dipping below 100,000 for the last couple of years. With the drought conditions, hypothetically and theoretically, some of the explanation, sometimes the lands that are privately owned, the reason they're usually developed in the first place is they've got water associated with them, or they're associated with some kind of a better quality habitat, and then the improvements that are added to that habitat make that habitat even more attractive to wildlife. And despite the fact that our deer populations may be declining, this may be some of the best quality habitat that's available. So despite the fact that we may have numbers declining, they'll still concentrate on private land. So based on the review that we conducted, the issues we've identified is that we do need a centralized review and approval process. In some cases, approvals were granted by a single individual and didn't receive much review. And so this is an internal process, and this one that the agency is going to be dealing with. We'll centralize that review, and the approval process will come through the Game Division's administrative office, so that we'll be able to tabulate those, and we'll know where we are. Another thing that the commission adopted this year that also addresses some of this is that by adopting a quota or a cap in May for the upcoming year, we know how close we're coming to that. So we'll be able to better evaluate and assess, are we approaching that cap, because we know what the cap is. NAC 502-4246 1F requires mitigation where possible, but that's one thing that we don't document really well. That's part of an internal process, but it could probably benefit from some external review, some input from our cooperators on how that might, how we might do that, what we might look at and be able to document that. And finally, the one that probably we most need some external assistance with is probably identifying a process to equitably distribute tags when we do reach that cap, when we're starting to approach that. The commission has the authority to develop regulation, but the stakeholders, landowners, sportsmen, Farm Bureau, the folks that we've been involved in as we've been going through this, their input would be very valuable. Some of the concepts that we received from sportsmen and from the landowners we spoke with, and these were presented to the commission for their consideration, included a proportional reduction of tags across all qualified applicants, reducing the number of tags allocated to cooperators by doing it to the people that qualified for the fewest first, since they had the least impact. They were least impacted by the wildlife. Limited the availability to first come, first serve. We know what the quota is now, and we could just simply say, you know, we're going to issue it first come, first serve. Challenge, of course, is that some of those landowners may be affected by wildlife at different times. Voluntary reductions. We could eliminate counts and during the dormant season, when crops are not growing. But if we were to do that, some of the effects of wildlife also include fence damage, ground compaction, things of that nature. Estimate proportional use by deer and antelope across seasons, or some other fashion. These are just an example of some of the information that we were provided by the public, the affected public. But what I'd like to recommend are a potential course of action that the commission could direct the department to pursue. And the department could host stakeholder meetings. At this point, what we'd recommend is perhaps one per administrative region. We would notice the landowners, the cabs, the Farm Bureau, sportsmen. We would make it a pretty broad effort to try to let them know we're going to be in this area at this time, and do one for each administrative region to solicit solutions. At that point, we're not trying to pick the best one. What we're trying to do is get as many ideas on the table as possible. We would develop the cumulative list, add that to the existing list, and we could then solicit input from the people who attended those and or provided input to those, and ask which are the most acceptable solutions, which ones have the most merit. We could then present that concept at a subsequent meeting for the commission's evaluation. You know, the commission could certainly participate to the extent that they felt warranted, and we could then present that back at a future date for the commission's consideration. Those are the thoughts that we've got at this point in time regarding this. I would open it up to questions, be glad to try and address any the commission may have.
Thank you, Mr. Wakeling. I have a quick question. One of the problems you said that you saw was you didn't see the problem coming soon enough. What potentially could we do to solve that issue?
Mr.
Or what
Chairman?
led to that issue, I guess,
Yeah.
as well?
Mr. Chairman, members of the commission, currently the approval process for a landowner voucher would routinely go, in some cases, straight from the investigating biologist to the license office. The current form, the current approval process wouldn't come through Game Division headquarters at all. And so we had no idea. Also, it's not centralized, so we would have biologists in the western region and the eastern region, or the southern region, operating independently of one another. And so by having those come through the headquarters office, we'll be able to keep tabs on that. The other aspect of it is that with the knowing what the cap is at this point in time, knowing that the cap's 502, we can look at that and we can monitor how close we're getting to that number.
Thank you, Mr. Wakeling. Commissioner Barnes?
Yeah, before we get too much further with this discussion, I think I need to disclose that on our family ranch in various years, we have participated in this program, which gives me insight, I guess, kind of on both sides, is from a landowner perspective too. But I just thought everybody needed to be aware that we have participated in this program in the past.
Thank you, Commissioner Barnes. Further commission questions? Commissioner Hubbs?
I brought, the last time we had this come forward, I brought up some issues, and I still somewhat have some of the concerns, just because the overall purpose appears to be at first that landowners should be compensated purely for damage. And what we found is that there's not a very thorough, at least as reported by the department, not a very thorough measurement of damage, of what damage might be. And that when there's a site visit made, it typically is made to conduct a count only. And then they prescribe the number of tags per count only. Some of the data doesn't make sense outside of just potentially development in and of itself, because if you have deer numbers going down in Antelope, numbers somewhat stable, I think they were. There has been a rise in landowner compensation tags. So there's something going on there. There seems to be an increase in the need for landowner incentive tags. And I would like to kind of go into that as to why, because obviously everyone draws competitively for game tags. And it would be a shame if the way that the system is now is that you go buy land, you're able to just claim damage, you get private tags, and you can issue them, out to family members or so on and so forth. And I'm not saying that that's what people do. I'm just saying we should be careful about not creating a system that would allow that to take place. And my last question, I know I'm just kind of going on, but I do have a question as to the funds received by the landowner. Are they documented and reported back to the state? Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, Commissioner Hubbs, Brian Wakeling for the record. In response to your first comment on the damage, as I read the statute, that's certainly something that I think that could be incorporated into the assessment, the evaluation of how the tags are awarded into the future. It's not something that specifically is addressed currently within NAC. Obviously, the goal is to compensate a landowner for damage. And I think in a situation where wildlife gets concentrated, regardless of the number that we have in total, in a drought period, as you start to concentrate wildlife in certain areas that may have water available, for instance, or a commercial grain or hay meadow or something of that nature, the pressure may actually increase during those years, despite the fact that there's fewer animals out there, because conditions on the landscape could be worse. The point you bring up about landowners or individuals looking to acquire land specifically for the advantage that a compensation tag might be offered, I believe is very real. We have had people contact our office and specifically ask questions about how much land do I have to have, all the information associated with that. And so my sense is that that's probably happening. I'm not accusing any individual who's been in the program for a lengthy period of time or even a couple of years currently of doing that, but I do know we've been getting some requests. Can't remember exactly what your last question was.
Reporting of the
because
I believe they
revenues.
Right, they sell the tags at times, and then that in turn, I remember speaking with some of the fellow commissioners, is the compensation, if you will, for the damage done.
Yes.
So,
my apologies for getting the details of the question, but currently those landowners have no responsibility to report that to the agency. We are sometimes made aware of the values that are being placed on these, but those are private transactions, and for the most part, the department is outside of the actual transaction. We do have some estimates of what those transactions may go for. It differs dramatically on the area. Certain areas tend to produce older age class animals with larger antler size. In places like that, oftentimes their value will go up.
Did you have something, Commissioner Young? Commissioner Young.
I think I mentioned at the last meeting we talked about this, Brian. Is there any way to establish one value for compensation tags per animal? And is there any thought, or is there any state that just offers that in dollar compensation rather than these tags? Because I know personal experience, I've paid anywhere from $2,000 for a deer tag to $6,000 to a deer tag, depending on how greedy that rancher particularly had to be that year. And I say greedy because it's the same guy. One year it's 2,000. Next year he knows he can get me for 2. I might as well hit him for 4. Oh, he's making a little more money. I'll hit him for 6 the next year. And I don't think it's right. And we were talking about, was using the word commercialization of reptiles yesterday. I'd like to know what the difference is between that and this. On the flip side of that, ranching's a tough business. And if a rancher is not cooperative with the department and with animal life, the animals suffer. So there's the true rancher that needs this to balance it out, and I think that's the majority of them. It's the guy that goes and buys the land, like you said, specifically to do what I mentioned that we need to eliminate. And how do other states do it? To kind of get to that point right there where you get the greed versus the need.
Mr. Chairman, Commissioner Young, states use any variety of different approaches. And I couldn't speak to the without doing some further research. I don't think it would be appropriate for me to speak too broadly on it. But I do know like Arizona did not offer any compensation at all. Other states have got, Utah's got a cooperative wildlife management unit program that differs somewhat from what Nevada's is. And so certainly there is a possibility to address any one of the concerns you might have however, to dramatically revamp the system that we're using now undoubtedly will require some legislative action. It's not something we can simply handle through NEC. The overall framework that we have to work with is defined currently under the statutes that we're working under.
I got one thing real quick, Vice Chairman. I just wanted to address the greed versus need. I take a little bit of an exception to the $2,000 one year, $6,000 another year. I get what you're saying on that, but I think unless you truly know the damages that person incurred, I think it's hard to lump people into that category. And I'm not saying it's not happening, but I feel like I
can
want
tell you it happens.
Well, I know it happens, but what I'm saying is I feel like by that comment, you've lumped a lot of people into a group, and that's my group, and I kind of want to stand up for some of those people because I know there's a lot of people that probably really need this program, and I'm sure there's some that aren't. So I'm not saying you're wrong.
I think you misunderstood. I said I understand the need for the real need, but I don't understand how people can go buy a piece of land specifically to get hunting tags, and we differentiate that from any other commercialization of the wildlife in this state, because that land was purchased specifically, in some cases by wealthy people, simply for their hunting opportunities for an exclusive group of people. And those are people that can afford it, rather than the average sportsman that can't. And that's where the balance is out, in my opinion. Certainly there's fair market value, I get it. But I apologize if you took it that way, because certainly my family came from the cattle business here in the state. I understand how difficult it is. I'm not talking about you guys that are growing crops or raising cattle needing to get that replacement. I'm talking about those that game the system. So let's separate that, please.
Okay, and I understand, but I wanted to put it out there that not everyone is doing it that way.
I didn't say that they did. I said there are that do.
I just wanted to clarify that,
Okay.
and I also want to get it out there that I think that year to year you're going to have differences, and not only that, I think you're going to have a hard time being able to differentiate the people that are gaming the system versus the people that really need the compensation. And I wish there was a way to do that, but I don't know. I can't foresee how you could pick one person out and say this guy's gaming the system, and this guy over here is not. But that's what I'm saying. I'm not saying that you're wrong, that it's not happening, but I think I want it out there that we need to look at it from a big perspective as well. That it's a program that's very needed, and there are some people that probably take a heck of a lot of damage, maybe don't live in one of those areas where they can sell it for a lot of money.
Right.
To recoup some of that damage. And I guess some of my perspective on this is that we talk about this and the damage, when we're talking about documenting the damage. I'd like to see some stuff where we actually take some pictures and we have some things like that. Because, I mean, distinctly, one of my first meetings when I was on the commission, there was a picture, and it was, regardless, I mean, it was elk, it wasn't deer, but there was a picture of this hayfield, and it was just destroyed. And the conversation kind of came about as though, and the elk program obviously is different. They got paid an amount, and part of the conversation was, oh, I can't believe it was that much. And to me, as a farmer, when I looked at that picture, I thought, man, you got off cheap. So I think for us to sit down with some perspective and see some of this damage documented, I think it would help a lot of people on the commission to see that. Because I can see, and I can realize that something that maybe doesn't look like damage to the ordinary person is very damaging, would be to me, if I was in that situation.
Right. And that's what my point of my question is, can we establish a value to the damage?
But see, that's where I think it's hard.
Yeah. And it
Because
may
one
be-
person may have some damage that is very little, and another person may have a whole bunch. But how do you put one value on a tag and say, Joe Farmer over here, you only get $3,500, and the same guy over here gets $3,500, but he might have $15,000 worth of damage. And that's where I think the line, it's too hard to put a value on that tag that fits landowner A and landowner B. I can appreciate where you're coming from and trying to simplify it, but I think that's where I can run into an issue of putting just a value on it, because it's too hard to value it for one person versus another. And year to year, that could change entirely. For the same.
I see your point,
for the
but
same
I'll tell you,
location.
there's certain landowner or compensation tags, landowner tags, and I think there is a difference between the two, if I'm not mistaken. And we probably gotta make sure that everybody's understanding the difference, but you can go down to the southern part of the state and certain guides get the same tags year after year after year from the same ranchers. It's almost like they're running a private hunting club down here, according to some of my constituents, and they've described it to me in great detail, and these are credible people that have brought this to me, and it does create an unfair advantage system to the wealthy class or a class of hunter that can afford to do and pay whatever to hunt some of the premier areas with the biggest deer in the state of Nevada year after year, and or buy elk tags that, are a once in a lifetime for a lot of us. I think it's our responsibility to prevent that from happening. I don't care what it, being in business, whether it's ranching or any other business, there are risks to it, and I get that. Believe me, it's a risky business. And the rancher could simply fence out the animal, I understand that, and hurt the process, hurt wildlife. And I'm not saying that's what we need to do. I'm just saying there's got to be a solution or make this more equitable, that the person putting in for a tag and gets a tag every 5 years doesn't have to kowtow to the guy that can afford to spend $25,000, $30,000 every year to deer hunt. I just don't think it's right. It doesn't sit well with me. And that's where I'm trying to end up at, is to balance that out. And if I've offended anybody in the process, I apologize, but I still hold on to those beliefs that I have.
Commissioner Young, first of all, I don't want you to think that you offended me. I just wanted to clarify where I stand on it and put some information out there that other people can look at, because I feel like in this whole conversation that we're getting tied up with what these tags sell for. And I think at this point, to me, I feel better that we can compensate these landowners and keep them in the program to where they still allow access to their property. Because if you shut it off, I don't know how good that's gonna be for the animals. I mean, it's kind of, we had the discussion earlier today about, I think it was Dr. Dixon brought up that once we started this watering, they had to keep the water going because the animals are now relying on that. So you go shutting that off, what are you doing to the resource at that point? And
Well,
I think the money is getting in the way here instead of just trying to make the program work. But I do see what you're saying, where it's going to these guides and they buy it year and year after that. But you know what? If I was in that situation where I actually able to receive landowner tags, if I found somebody that did a good job for me and always got me a decent, fair price, that's where it's going to go all the time. As to look for someone new all the time trying to sell that tag, I think you could see that happening. And a lot of people in my situation, I wouldn't really want to deal with the in-between.
One other
So-
point I'll make is that I've been told, and here again, I'm glad we're having this discussion, that these vouchers may be sold by the landowner one time, and the person that purchases it, there's no signature or documentation, and if they're resold or kept in the pocket of certain guides, that's, you can figure out who I'm honing in on, guides, that hang on to these and maybe wait to the last minute, and didn't quite fill that tag for that client, and will sell it again additional time to somebody else, or for a different amount. In other words, it's not just a one-time, you get X amount of dollars for your compensation, that a secondary market, much like tickets at concert tickets or sporting events, enter a secondary market, and it's bumped up significantly beyond what the rancher got. You heard of that, or has anybody heard of that?
I can't say that I've personally heard of that. I could totally see it happening. But once again, I feel like we're honing in on the dollar value of this. And in the long run, we're looking at compensating someone. And if the farmer rancher sold that tag to someone and he thought he got his fair value and compensation, that's what's important to me. What someone sells it for down the road, is it right? I can't say that it is.
Well,
I'm not gonna say
if
that
we're
right
allowing it as a commission to go on, and we know it's not right, ethically or morally, it is our obligation. We're managing the, public's resource. We're obligated to protect the public resource. Heard that yesterday when it came to the reptiles. Same thing here. It's a resource that belongs to the state, not to a specific person. But I've argued enough my point. Say.
Vice Chairman Johnson, I think before I stepped ahead of you.
I think some of the comment whether a landowner needed the compensation or didn't need the compensation is, I don't think that need is relevant. They need it. The issue is whether the damage occurred. And I think what my question to Mr. Wakeling was going to be is, have we gotten to the point where we're just doing counts? I mean, is it just say, I got them on my property, come out, take a look, I count them up, mathematical formula, here's the number of tags you get. Because if that's what occurring, we're not really focused in on what the statute and the regulations say, which is the landowner has suffered damage, they identify the damage, they report it to the department can then award tags no more than 1 per 50 deer or antelope on the property. If it's just, and see what I hear, and I don't know if there's any truth to it whatsoever, but what I've been told is that property owners, numbers get there, they make the phone call, the count gets done, they then get their tags. They may take some action that move those animals a little ways, and then the neighbor makes the phone call and gets the tags. Now, I don't know if there's any truth to that whatsoever, but I've been told that, so I don't know if it's true or not. My question is though, where in that process are we identifying the damage for which the landowner is being compensated? Because the administrative code talks to that, so Director Walsley might answer this question because I see he's raising his hand.
I think that damage is defined as any decrease in quantity or quality of forage. And The idea was is if there were 50 animals documented on that private property, it'd be pretty difficult for them to be present without some decrease in quantity or quality of forage. As far as the burden to quantify that damage, I mean, this is the same caution that I guess I issued yesterday when we were contemplating possible regulations around commercial collection of reptiles. We have a very small wildlife agency. This program was designed to be carried out in a way that allowed us to spend our time and energy meeting the needs of wildlife to the extent that we could. We could design a program that puts our biologists in the field in a way that we can begin to quantify that damage and really tighten up this program. We could probably occupy all of our biologists and many of our wardens' time in administering the regulations that were contemplated around reptile collection and now are potentially going to be considered around administering this program. But the broader question is at what cost? What does that do to our ability to rehab sagebrush? And so the way that it was designed and implemented was to make it as easy as possible for the landowners to understand it and the department to administer it. And what's happened, to answer some of Commissioner Hubb's questions about participation, you can see a decrease in those herds, but what we're seeing is not only an increase in distribution of antelope, for example, but we're also seeing an increase in participation of the program. It is lucrative. I have had a number of conversations with other western states, and I think that our current program, although arguably more simply administered than many of the programs in the western states, is also recognized to be more lucrative in terms of compensating people for those damages. But there's a trade-off in having a program that quantifies the actual damage versus its ease of administration. And so I just wanted to share those thoughts.
I wasn't speaking to quantifying the damages. I was just saying that there should be some element of damage. And I don't know if we're just assuming that if a count's done on a given day and the number exceeds 50, then at least one tag's going to be issued. And you don't even know how many days the animals were on the property or what are they doing on the property that year? I mean, are they farming it? Is it in a crop? I mean, what's going on? I mean, I'm just saying, I don't say I want to quantify it, but I think we have to take a step back and, it seems like what's in place just needs to be followed, and we just can't have a system where it's just counts. That seems too simplistic to me.
Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, Commissioner Johnson, this is Brian Wakeling. Some of the concerns and a lot of what's being discussed now are exactly the kinds of concerns that have been brought up by the cooperators. They've been brought up by sportsmen. There are one of the concepts that were brought forward. There are examples where an individual landowner may have 47 deer camped on his private land for 365 days. In another area, a landowner may have 500 animals move in one night, and that happens to be the night that the count is conducted. And to some degree, we know that there's this level of variability. The first landowner wouldn't qualify for any. The second landowner would qualify for 10. How do we equitably distribute that? And to Director Wasley's point, the administration of the compensation tag program is far less of a drain on our personnel time than what the elk incentive tag program is. Oftentimes, an individual landowner with the elk incentive tag, especially if it's one that's closely scrutinizing us, may cost us, 13, half a human resource month, whereas this may only constitute a single night. Now, I think all of the biologists that go out and look at these kind of things try to document that, yes, indeed, we can see that there is some damage as a result of wildlife. They verify the tracks, they look for sign before they'll even agree to do the count. But I think the place where we're probably in accordance with existing statute and existing NEC that we probably fall down the most is in truly documenting what kind of mitigating activities are we engaging in. Is there an opportunity to engage in a mitigation? Another example that you brought up is somebody trying to do something to move wildlife around. Individual biologists have encountered individual landowners at times using ATVs or some other technique to try to haze animals into an area. When they observe that or when they detect it, they deny those tags for that year. That's something that our personnel do pay attention to. It's something that they do try to document. Are we perfect? Probably not, but it certainly gets into the resource commitment that Director Wosley was referencing. You can bring up the same question regarding law enforcement on any one of our opening hunts. We just honestly don't have the resources to be able to perfectly enforce the rules and regulations that we have.
Mr. Johnston?
I understand, I think the mitigation thing's important, but I don't want to see mitigation taken to the point where it's detrimental to wildlife, where it's, well, to mitigate the damage, you're going to try to fence out animals, and that's not a good result. I don't know what other type of mitigation there is. But one of the things that keeps coming up, and it seems to me is and I think it's just a distraction, is how much is being paid for the tags or tags being resold. I mean, I just know a lot of property owners where I live, and there's no landowner big game tags there, but people do the goose hunts and guided goose hunts. The property owners just don't want to deal with the hunters. And if they make an arrangement with a guide, it's very convenient for them. It works out for the best, and the landowner just doesn't want to be involved. And they want also someone who they can hold responsible if something is done on that property, in the sense of, look, I gave you the permission to hunt on this field, there's trash and all that, you're out. You know, they don't want to be dealing with that. So if the landowner is happy with the price they get in their agreement with the guide or whoever, and the guide marks that price up, if the landowner's happy with that situation and doesn't mind it, then I don't have any heartburn over that whatsoever. He or she is making that decision that they're happy with the value that they receive from the tag. That's compensating them for the damage. So I can understand a lot of reasons why a landowner would want to do that. I'm not so certain there's a real need for major revisions in this. It seems to be working. I just wondered if it was administered a little bit better. That addressed some of the problems. Because I really think if it comes down to it, let's say you can't resell the tags. Landowner has to sell it to the person that's ultimately going to use the tag. There's still going to be the middle person involved. The guide's going to find the hunters, put them in touch with the landowner. I mean, full disclosure, I got a call, it was like a week and a half ago, asking me if I was interested in a landowner elk tag. And I said, sure. And it wasn't the landowner. It was a guide who was working with the landowner. They had some extra tags. And I can see exactly where that landowner doesn't want to be trying to find someone to buy the tags if someone else is willing to do it. So I think I appreciate that there's only so much resources that the department has, but I think if we're seeing that there's some inconsistency in the application of this program, the way it's carried out, or some improvements that can be made in that, I think that's the first step. Let's get some consistency across the state. Let's improve approve the manner in which it's done, so it's done the best we can, and I don't mean to be disparaging to the department. I know there's, resources are stretched, but if that's steps that can be taken, maybe we should take those steps first before we open up a can of worms, trying to revamp this process, make significant changes to it.
Mr. Chairman, one of the points that I'd like to reiterate from the department's review on this, and probably clarify, probably didn't make the point clear, but what we tried to focus on was with the existing statute, in order to implement effectively what the shortcomings that we saw from this current year. And so administratively, we can address a couple of them. One of them truly needs some either commission regulation or general regulation to be able to address it into the future, and that being, if we reach a point where we have to reduce the allocation of tags, what process we do that. The department did not consider issues that were statutory in nature, such as fees, and things of that nature. So my presentation was designed to really kind of talk to the scope that we had considered so far.
I have a question. It seems to me if we ran into the cap again, couldn't a fair way to do it say you're going to get one tag instead of animals, you just up that number to one for every 60? That would be the fairest way, it seems, to do it. Because it's obvious that the legislature wants some cap on the number of landowner tags that can be issued. So if that happens, then I think one of the ways you have to do it is be across the board, is because the statute is no more than one per 50, so you could increase that number. That might be one way to do it. That certainly hurts the person who had 52 animals on their property. But the guy who has 48 can say the same thing today, is the example that was given. So,
And Mr. Chairman, the other aspect of what our focus in this presentation was to discuss a method by which you might seek other ideas. And so the concept of trying to hold stakeholder meetings, that idea is one that we had not considered prior to this point, but the recommendation the department has is that we go ahead and consider having some stakeholder meetings to get greater input with some additional ideas that the commission can then discuss.
So I have one more question. So, when generally do the counts occur? Just sometime during the year when the landowner reports or asks for the department to come out?
Mr. Chairman, Commissioner Johnson, after the landowner contacts us, then there's a 10-day period in which that contact has to occur, and we mutually agree upon a date to look at that.
And then tags get issued the following year?
That is correct.
And are we taking steps to make sure the landowners know when that count occurs? So let's say there is in fact damage and there's 150 animals on someone's property. Everything's been verified. That person right now, current system would get 3 tags, each 50, correct? Are we notifying the landowners when these count occurs? There's no guarantee you're actually going to get this number of tags because of the statutory cap. I mean, it seems to me we need to be notifying the participants that, yes, the count is there. We've deemed you eligible for this number of tags, but it doesn't mean that's the number you're going to get, because depending upon participation levels and everything else, we could hit into a statutory cap where that number might get adjusted. So don't go spend the money you're planning on getting for all 3 tags.
Commissioner Johnson, you're absolutely correct. That type of information needs to be included. It has not been something that has routinely been, although there's a reference to the statute, there's no specific reference to the statutory cap. And so we agree completely. As we go through this process, that's one of the things we certainly want to include, including the method that will be used to resolve any over-allocation once that's determined. But the addition of, trying to centralize the approval process and including information like that, I did not mention that, but that is certainly something that we believe absolutely has to be mentioned up front with the landowners so that they're aware of it.
Commissioner Young, I think we got off in the weeds. I think you were wanting to speak, or do you still have something, or?
I think Commissioner Johnson partially addressed it, but what is the definition of an extra tag, Brad? Extra tag. You said he had selling extra tags? No, I think. Because I can tell you, waiting 9 years on, I'm not making fun of you. I'm just saying that's the attitude that some of them have. Waiting 9 years for a bonus point to draw my first elk tag in Nevada, at my age at 61, I'll probably never be able to get another one. There's no such thing as an extra tag.
Maybe a poor choice of words. I think what I meant was he had a certain number of landowner tags and he had not sold them all. So in my mind, it was an extra tag. Yeah. And I'm hoping it may have my name on it here.
Yeah. And as far as getting information, I know you and I get some of this information from the very same gentleman who I name will not, it's a personal friend of mine, a hunting partner of mine, and I'm convinced he's a credible individual, and he tells me these things, and I just don't want any of you guys to think that, especially you, Grant, that I'm out to get the ranchers, or, I know Pete's family never even put in for him, especially while he was on the commission, and he probably sure could have, and Tom disclosed it. You guys aren't what I'm talking about, just so we're clear on that. There's another segment out there that get out there and look around on some of these things, advertising, and you tell me how many Nevada sportsmen can afford $100,000 to go elk hunting every year. There's a few, I get it, but it's our job, in my opinion, to balance it out to where the guy that makes far, far, far less than that and has 5 mouths to feed has an opportunity to hunt the same animal. That's all I'm saying. And I know it's very difficult to get to with the resources, and that's something we got to put our thinking caps on, because the department is very, very limited, particularly when it comes to this. So it's a balancing act. But I appreciate what you're trying to do here, Brian.
And real quick, Bill, I just want you to know that is one thing that I love about this commission, is that we can sit here and we can have a discussion. We're all done. We can all go outside. We can go to dinner, laugh, and have a good time. And so you're not offending me. I just want you to know where I stand and the people that I represent stand. And I'm sure we're going to hear from some of those people once we get to public comment. And I think Commissioner Hubbs has one more thing. Has anybody else got? And then Commissioner Barnes after that. Commissioner Hubbs.
So now that I understand the narrower approach you're after, so you're saying we've got our statute, we've got our code, all the department's really asking for is what type of regulatory framework should we have in place, should we come up against meeting the cap in the future? And one of the things I was thinking of is that speaks to some of the issue of concern that I had is the main purpose of the landowner incentive tag is to compensate for damage and also to promote mitigation, right? It's to go out to the site, assess the damage, award the tags appropriately, and then there's also the mitigation arm. And so is there any way, while somebody is out there counting herds of deer, that they could somehow put together a spectrum or a quick assessment of damage and mitigation in place, and perhaps individuals who have either more damage or have improved through mitigation be awarded more tags if the cap is being met?
Mr. Chairman, Commissioner Hubbs, I believe that we can certainly look for, I think that is something we can certainly take comment on and look for avenues that might improve.
I got Commissioner Barnes first, Commissioner McNinch.
I'm just gonna kind of take a step back and maybe address something that Commissioner Johnson was asking, kind of from my perspective, as being a cooperator, we do the counts, and you say just come out and count the deer and give you the tags. Well, and I'm talking just because I'm familiar with our particular area. I don't know how it is around the rest of the state or working with different individuals. But over time, as a landowner, you establish a relationship with the area biologist.